In the early morning hours of June 30, 1908, something tore across the Siberian sky and changed the forest forever. Official history calls it the Tunguska event, a massive explosion that flattened more than 80 million trees across a remote stretch of wilderness near the Podkamennaya Tunguska River. Scientists would later conclude that a meteoroid likely exploded in the atmosphere, creating a powerful airburst without leaving an impact crater. But long before scientists arrived, the Evenki people who lived in that region spoke of a fire spirit descending from the heavens. They said the sky split open. They said the ground shook so violently that reindeer were thrown like toys and hunters were knocked unconscious. They said the forest burned without flame. And some of them said something else came down with the light. For nearly 20 years, the site remained largely untouched by formal investigation. The land was too remote, the terrain too punishing. When Russian mineralogist Leonid Kulik finally led an expedition into the region in the 1920s, he expected to find a crater, a massive scar in the earth that would explain the devastation. Instead, he found a pattern that defied simple explanation. Trees lay flattened outward in a near-perfect radial formation, all pointing away from a central zone. Yet at the center itself, the trees still stood upright, stripped of branches and scorched, but not knocked down. It was as though something had exploded in the air above them. Or as though something had descended carefully, pressing the forest outward without fully touching the ground. The official explanation of an atmospheric explosion satisfied most researchers, but it did not quiet the stories. Hunters avoided the central zone for years. Animals were said to behave strangely near the epicenter. Some reported that compasses malfunctioned. Others claimed the air felt heavy, as though charged before a storm. Over time, vegetation returned, but it grew unevenly. Certain patches flourished unnaturally fast, while others remained stunted and twisted. The forest healed, but imperfectly, like scar tissue over a wound that never fully closed. Decades passed, and the event slowly transformed from catastrophe to curiosity. Photographs of the flattened trees became textbook material. Diagrams of the blast pattern were studied in universities. The Tunguska explosion was categorized, analyzed, theorized. Yet no fragments large enough to definitively confirm the object's composition were ever recovered. No crater was found. No single, undeniable piece of evidence ended the debate. The mystery lingered, not dramatic enough to terrify the world, but unresolved enough to trouble it. More than a century later, a small independent documentary team decided to revisit the site. They wanted to capture drone footage of the radial tree pattern and document how the forest had regenerated over time. To them, the story was scientific, historical, almost routine. They were not ghost hunters. They were not thrill seekers. They were researchers chasing a viral story about one of the greatest natural explosions in recorded history. They packed cameras, satellite phones, GPS devices, environmental sensors, and enough supplies to spend a week in the wilderness. They flew into Krasnoyarsk, hired a local guide familiar with the terrain, and made their way toward the scar that was still visible from the sky. At first, the forest seemed ordinary, dense, quiet, immense. But as they moved closer to the historical epicenter, something changed. It was subtle. The guide noticed it first. The birdsong diminished. Insects grew sparse. The usual chaotic hum of forest life thinned into a strange, muffled stillness. The air felt oddly insulated, as if sound itself were being absorbed. The team joked about it at first, blaming nerves and suggestion. After all, they were walking into one of the most infamous explosion sites in history. Of course it would feel eerie. Their instruments began to behave unpredictably on the second day. GPS signals drifted, placing them several meters from their actual location. A drone sent overhead captured intermittent static, its footage warping at the edges as though the air itself shimmered. One of the environmental sensors recorded brief spikes in electromagnetic readings that quickly returned to normal. Nothing extreme. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to make them double-check their equipment and frown. That night, one of the researchers woke to a low vibration. It wasn't loud. It didn't echo. It felt internal, like a distant engine humming through the ground and into her bones. She stepped outside her tent and stood beneath the pale Siberian sky. The trees loomed tall and skeletal. For a moment, she thought she saw the air between them ripple, like heat rising from asphalt, except the temperature was near freezing. She blinked, and it was gone. The forest remained silent, almost watchful. By the third day, small inconsistencies began to accumulate. Timestamps on different cameras were out of sync by several minutes. Their guide insisted that a marked trail looked different from how he remembered it. A cluster of fallen trunks appeared more tightly arranged than they had been the day before. The team argued gently, attributing everything to fatigue and the disorienting uniformity of the landscape. The radial pattern of flattened trees, still faintly visible in certain areas, created a sense of geometric repetition that made orientation difficult. When they finally reached what historical maps identified as the approximate epicenter, they found a clearing where upright, branchless trunks still stood like blackened poles. It was not dramatic or glowing or visibly unnatural. It was simply wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate. The spacing of the trees felt deliberate. The silence felt thick. The air felt faintly pressurized, as though a storm were about to break, yet the sky was clear. The humming returned that evening, stronger this time. All 4 members of the team acknowledged it. Audio equipment picked up a low-frequency vibration at the edge of human hearing. It fluctuated in a slow rhythm, almost like breathing. They checked for underground water movement, seismic activity, even distant aircraft. Nothing explained it. The guide grew visibly uneasy and suggested they leave the following morning. Before they could act on that decision, one of the cameras captured something that none of them noticed in real time. Reviewing footage inside the tent, they saw that for 3 consecutive frames, less than a second of recorded time, the background behind one of the researchers bent inward, as though space itself had folded slightly. The trees appeared curved toward a central invisible point. Then the image returned to normal. No glitch signature. No compression artifact. Just a brief distortion. Panic did not erupt immediately. It grew slowly, seeded by uncertainty. When the humming intensified and their satellite phone failed to connect despite clear skies, the decision to leave became urgent. They packed quickly, retracing what they believed to be their entry path. But the forest did not feel the same. Landmarks were harder to recognize. The arrangement of fallen trunks seemed altered. Their guide stopped twice, confused, insisting that the terrain was subtly different. Then one of them vanished. There was no scream. No crash. One moment he walked several steps behind the others, camera in hand. The next moment, the space he occupied was empty. His camera lay on the ground, still recording. They rushed back, calling his name, expecting to find him injured behind a tree or fallen into a depression. There was nothing. The recording showed him turning slightly, as if reacting to a sound just beyond the range of the microphone. The image warped violently for an instant, trees bending inward toward the center of the frame. Then static. Then normal forest floor, empty. Terror fractured their composure. They shouted until their voices broke. The humming deepened, resonating through the soil. One of them began to cry, insisting that the forest felt as though it were closing in. And in a way that defied logic, it seemed true. The radial geometry that had once spread outward now felt reversed, as though the pattern were subtly contracting. In her final recorded entry, the lead researcher spoke in a trembling whisper. She speculated that the 1908 explosion might not have been a simple impact or airburst. She wondered if it had been a transition, a moment when something entered our atmosphere not as a solid object, but as a distortion of energy or space. The blast flattened the forest because reality itself flexed outward to accommodate the arrival. What remained was not debris, but presence. An invisible anomaly spanning kilometers, interacting subtly with magnetic fields, biological growth, and perception itself. Not a creature in the traditional sense, but a region of altered physics. A wound in the sky that never fully sealed. Her final footage, later recovered by authorities after the team failed to return, showed the clearing of upright trunks. The air shimmered faintly, like a mirage. For a fraction of a second, the image suggested impossible geometry, angles folding inward, light bending around something unseen. Then the recording cut. Official reports attributed the disappearances to environmental hazards. Exposure. Disorientation. The Siberian wilderness is vast and unforgiving. The explanation satisfied most. After all, the Tunguska event has a widely accepted scientific theory. An asteroid or comet fragment exploded in the atmosphere. Case closed. And yet, satellite images still show the old radial scar faintly etched into the forest canopy. Researchers occasionally note minor magnetic irregularities in the region. Nothing dramatic. Nothing conclusive. Just small deviations. Small distortions. On certain cold June mornings, locals say the forest falls unnaturally silent. They say the air hums very softly, too low to clearly hear but strong enough to feel in the chest. They say compasses sometimes hesitate. They say the trees, in the very center of the old blast zone, seem to lean ever so slightly inward now, as though whatever arrived in 1908 did not leave. As though the explosion was not an ending, but an opening. And as though, somewhere beneath the scarred Siberian soil, something vast and patient is still listening, waiting for the sky to split open once more.